When Alpha Kale Thorne rejected his mate in front of the whole pack, he was not confused. He was not trying to save her. He was not making some tragic noble sacrifice she would one day thank him for. He looked straight at Lyra Vale, chose politics over integrity, and humiliated her in public because he believed she was the easier thing to lose. Moonhall had been prepared for a celebration. Black and silver banners hung from the vaulted rafters. The torches in the iron braziers burned high enough to gild the stone wolves carved into the pillars. Council elders stood in formal robes near the Alpha dais. Warriors lined the outer walls in ceremonial leather. Servants carried trays of wine and spiced meat no one had yet touched. Everything in the room had been arranged to look like a beginning. But for Lyra, it was a public execution without blood. She stood in the center of the hall in a plain gray dress, one she had worn earlier that same day while helping in the kitchens. There was still a faint dusting of flour on one cuff. She had not been dressed as a Luna, not even as a guest. She had been summoned like a problem that needed to be handled in front of witnesses, and beside Kale stood Myral Voss, beautiful, controlled, elegant in white. The daughter of Alpha Darius Voss of Red Hollow, and the woman Nightfang's counsel had been preparing to put at Kale's side long before Lyra ever understood why the recent visits from Red Hollow had begun to feel like closing doors. Kale's face gave nothing away. That was somehow worse than anger. A furious man could still be reached. A cold man had already decided what your pain was worth. Lyra Vale, he said, his voice carrying through the hall with that calm alpha certainty the pack had been taught to trust. The bond between us means nothing. I reject you as my mate. I reject you as my future Luna. I reject any claim you imagined you had over me, my name, or my pack. The world did not stop. That was the terrible part. The world kept moving even when a life split in two. Someone inhaled sharply near the wall. A goblet tipped and spilled red wine over stone. One of the young servants near the back covered her mouth as if she could stop the cruelty of the moment from entering her. And then the bond hit. It ripped through Lyra's chest like a hooked blade. For one white, brutal second, her knees almost gave out. Her lungs forgot how to work. The room blurred. She could feel every eye in the hall on her face, waiting for the tears, waiting for her to break where everyone could watch. That was what they had gathered to see, not merely rejection, humiliation. A low-born mate publicly discarded so everyone else would remember what happened when fate misbehaved and power corrected it. Myral smiled. It was small, not triumphant, more insulting than that. The smile of a woman who thought another woman had just been reduced to history. Lyra should have broken, most girls would have, but then she saw Elder Sira. Nightfang's oldest lawkeeper had gone pale, not embarrassed, not pitying, afraid. And in that instant, through pain and shock and the savage tearing in her chest, Lyra heard her mother's voice from years ago. A whisper beside a dying fire, a warning tied to old law. If an alpha rejects an innocent, fated mate before witness, he owes the moon's price. The carved crescent seal beneath the alpha dais seemed to sharpen in her vision. Kale had forgotten it. The council had hoped no one remembered it. And Lyra had spent too many years learning in secret to waste the one weapon they never imagined she would dare use in public. She straightened, slowly, breath by breath. Not because she was no longer hurting, because she understood hurting and falling were not always the same thing. Kale frowned. "Do you understand what I said?" She looked at him, really looked. At the man who had once caught her on black ice outside the infirmary and stepped back from the mate bond as if it were a tactical inconvenience. At the man who had spent months pretending distance was wisdom while his council built an alliance around another woman. At the alpha who could have spoken to her privately, honestly, and did not. Then Lyra smiled. That smile changed the room. Myral's expression flickered. Several elders stiffened. Kale's eyes narrowed, not with triumph anymore, but with the first thread of uncertainty. Lyra took one step forward, then another. Her shoes tapped the stone floor loud enough that the hall seemed to fall silent around the sound. When she stopped below the dais, she dipped her chin with a calm so deliberate it felt like mockery wrapped in manners. "I understand perfectly, Alpha," she said. Her voice did not shake. That disturbed them more than tears would have. Say what you mean, Kale said. Elder Sira rose so abruptly her chair scraped the stone. That was the first crack. Lyra lifted her gaze to Kale's and said the 9 words that turned every old wolf in the hall to stone. I gladly accept your rejection, Alpha. Now pay up. For one heartbeat, no one moved. Even the torchfire seemed stunned. Then Myril laughed too quickly, too thinly. Excuse me. Lyra still did not look at her. She kept her eyes on Kale. Founder's law, she said. Or did no one think the servant girl could read? That landed harder than she expected. Not because of the insult, because of the truth inside it. Careful, girl, one elder snapped. No, Elder Sira said quietly, and somehow that quiet carried farther than shouting. Let her speak. All at once, fear moved through the room in visible waves. The clerks near the records table looked sick. The older counselors stopped looking indignant and started looking trapped. Warriors shifted their weight like men who suddenly understood they were standing inside history, not gossip. Kale stepped down from the dais, slow and dangerous. The pressure of his alpha aura flooded the hall hard enough to make weaker wolves lower their heads. Lyra felt it too, she simply refused to obey it. What exactly, he asked, voice low, do you think I owe? There it was, not denial, terms, he knew enough already. Lyra pointed toward the western arch windows where the dark line of mountain ridges could just be seen beyond the keep. Moonfall Keep, she said. I claim the dormant Luna holding attached to the western line. The room erupted. Moonfall was not just some ruined estate. It was old borderland, mineral-rich ground, and a fortress no one in Nightfang publicly valued, because publicly valuing it would have required remembering who it had once belonged to. Kale's expression hardened. You ask for too much. Lyra met his gaze without blinking. No, she said, I'm simply the first woman in this hall to ask for exactly what your law owes her. Then she drove the blade deeper. I also claim the debt ledger attached to Moonfall and all labor contracts maintained through expired emergency authority. Every debt-bound Omega under Nightfang's Western books is released effective tonight. This time, the gasps came from everywhere. A healer dropped her tray. 2 kitchen women near the back stared at Lyra like she had just spoken a foreign language that somehow sounded like freedom. Myril turned to Kale, true alarm finally replacing polished composure. You cannot permit this. Lyra looked at her then, not with hatred, with something colder. Permit, she asked softly. You still think this moment belongs to him, Myril's chin lifted. And you still think law protects girls like you. Lyra almost smiled. If it didn't, you wouldn't be frightened. That struck more cleanly than a slap. Elder Sira raised her staff. Alpha Kale Thorne, she said formally, do you deny that the rejection was public? Kale's jaw flexed. No, do you deny that Lyra Vale stands innocent of proven betrayal? His silence lasted too long, long enough for Lyra to see several counselors begin to sweat. Then, no, then by Founder's Law, Sira declared, the rejected mate may claim the moon's price. Moonhall broke, outrage, shock, panic, whispered oaths, open disbelief. Kale looked only at Lyra, not Myril, not the council. The low-born mate he had chosen to humiliate was now the single most dangerous person in the room. Finally he said, Moonfall Keep is yours. The hall reeled. The Western debt ledger as well, he added. The contracts are void. Lyra felt the bond still bleeding inside her, felt victory arrive not as joy, but as a place to stand while hurt stayed sharp. Kale took one more step toward her and lowered his voice enough that only those closest could hear. You've collected your price, he said. Be careful what kind of war you just started. Lyra's smile vanished. You started it, she said, when you assumed humiliation was free. Then she turned her back on the Alpha, on his chosen political bride, on the council that had expected her to collapse at their feet, and walked out of Moonhall with every eye in Nightfang fixed on her spine. No one stopped her. No one dared. And by the time the doors shut behind Lyra Vale, she was no longer the servant girl everyone thought they understood. She was the woman who had made an Alpha pay. Long before Nightfang knew Lyra as the girl who invoked dead law and walked away with a fortress, she had already learned what survival cost. It cost voice, it cost softness, and sometimes it cost being underestimated so completely that you became invisible even while standing in the center of the room. She was 8 years old when her mother pressed an iron key into her palm. Rain hammered their border cottage so hard it sounded like pebbles thrown by ghosts. The fire had burned low. Blood stained the hem of Lyra Vale's dress, though she kept trying to hide it beneath the folds, as if her daughter might somehow fear less if cloth swallowed evidence. "Close your hand," Lyra whispered. Lyra obeyed. The key was strangely heavy, colder than it should have been. "Listen to me," her mother said, kneeling so their faces were level. "There are truths powerful men bury when they think little girls won't live long enough to dig." "What truth?" Lyra asked. Lyra brushed damp hair from her face. "That old law survives longest in the mouths of people no one thinks matter." Lyra didn't understand then. She only understood the fear in her mother's eyes and the forced steadiness in her voice. The next morning, Lyra Vale was dead. The wolves who came for the cottage wore Nightfang colors and carried mercy in exactly the way bureaucrats carry mercy, cleanly worded, administratively useful, and completely hollow. They said her father had failed the western border. They said her mother had not been strong enough to keep the estate stable after his death. They said the Vale line no longer had the resources to maintain western claims during wartime emergency. No one mentioned that Lyra's father had died holding a line Nightfang delayed reinforcing. No one mentioned that papers reassigning Vale territory had been drafted before mourning rites were complete. No one mentioned Moonfall. That was the first lesson Lyra learned about rank. Power does not always lie by inventing new stories. Often it lies by removing the pieces that would make the old story impossible. Lyra was taken into Nightfang under pack protection. That phrase sounded generous until you lived inside it. Pack protection meant food, shelter, and the slow, organized erasure of whatever made you inconvenient to the story being told about your family's fall. She became useful. Usefulness is the safest disguise for girls powerful men would rather forget. She worked on shifts in the kitchens, carried linen in the healer's wing, swept training halls, and learned which doors were watched carefully and which ones only looked watched because no one thought servants would dare open them. Her wolf came late. That gave everyone something fresh to whisper about. Weak blood, broken line, moon forgotten, the border curse taking its due. Lyra let them whisper. People who whisper around you often stop remembering you are there. That was how she learned. She learned which elders quoted law loudly and which parts of law they carefully forgot. She learned how ledgers changed shape when land moved from one family into temporary administrative holding. She learned that men in power rarely bothered concealing contempt from women they assumed were harmless. Most importantly, she learned where old records were buried. The first time Elder Sira caught her asleep over a damaged legal codex in the lower archive, Lyra expected punishment. Instead, the old lawkeeper asked, "Why this book?" Lyra, too tired to lie properly, answered, "Because no one hides dangerous things in the laws they still quote in public." For a moment, Sira simply stared. Then she took the book from Lyra's lap, flipped to the torn page, and asked, "And what exactly do you think is missing?" Lyra pointed to a surviving fragment. "A Luna protection clause, property transfer maybe, or succession witness law." Sira's expression did not soften, but from that day on, certain cabinets were left not quite shut. Certain indexes appeared at the top of stacks. Certain sealed boxes somehow found their way into rooms Lyra happened to be cleaning. No one ever openly taught her. Sira simply stopped closing doors. By 16, Lyra knew 3 truths that would have ruined Nightfang's comfort if spoken aloud. First, Moonfall Keep had belonged to the Vale line under old Luna stewardship law. Second, the Wartime Council had absorbed it under procedures so irregular they would have collapsed under public review. Third, if an alpha publicly rejected an innocent fated mate before witness, the rejected mate could claim dormant Luna-held property as the moon's price. Moonfall was the last major dormant Luna asset attached to Nightfang territory. Lyra never expected she would need that knowledge, not because she lacked imagination, because she had never been foolish enough to imagine an alpha would become her mate, especially not Kale Thorne. Kale became alpha young and survived the role through sheer force of discipline. He was good in battle, ruthless in negotiation, efficient enough that wolves mistook his certainty for moral clarity. Nightfang respected him. Nightfang relied on him. Kale himself had not yet learned that being useful to a system and being good within it were not the same thing. To him, before the bond, Lyra existed at the edge of relevance. The quiet servant from the kitchens who helped in the infirmary. The girl with observant eyes and a habit of looking directly at people when they said stupid things. The one who never caused trouble. Then winter solstice happened. Lyra slipped on black ice outside the infirmary carrying a basket of dried herbs. Kale, crossing the courtyard after a dawn patrol briefing, caught her before she fell. His hand closed around her wrist, and the world changed. Mate scent hit them both at once. Cedar smoke, winter rain, crushed lavender. Recognition so immediate and violent it felt like someone had reached inside the center of Lyra's chest and struck a bell. She looked up at him. For one impossible second, she saw the same shock in his face that she felt in herself. Wonder, fear, need, then it vanished. Kale released her as if the bond itself were fire. He stepped back, his expression closed, not confusion. Calculation? Go inside, he said. That was all. No private conversation later. No attempt to understand what fate had just done to either of them. No honesty. Lyra lay awake that night on a narrow healer's cot and understood something with a clarity she wished she did not possess. Kale was not afraid of her. He was afraid of what needing her would cost him. And men who fear need are often the ones who cause the deepest damage while calling it necessity. After the bond, every humiliation came quietly. Kale avoided being alone with her. Myril Voss began appearing more often in Nightfang. Council meetings with Red Hollow increased, and the pack's whispers changed shape. The Alpha has options. A servant cannot be Luna. A bond is not a crown. Nightfang needs stability more than romance. Lyra watched, listened, prepared. By the time the summons to Moon Hall arrived, she already knew what he intended to do. What Kale never imagined was that the girl he intended to publicly discard had spent years learning the exact words capable of making his humiliation costly. He thought he was ending a problem. He was actually handing a patient, invisible woman the sharpest legal weapon Nightfang had forgotten it still possessed. By sunrise, the story had spread through every corridor of Nightfang Keep. Lyra had made the Alpha pay. Moonfall was hers. The labor contracts were void. Myril Voss had nearly cracked a goblet in public trying to keep her smile intact. The pack should have been celebrating the scandal. Instead, an uneasy tension settled over Nightfang like storm pressure. Everyone understood instinctively that something larger than gossip had just been disturbed. Old law, old land, old theft. These things do not wake politely. Lyra was signing the initial transfer register in the records chamber when Kale walked in. Not alone. Never alone. Two clerks trailed him with sealed boxes of Western keys and gate credentials. His face was once again carved from control. If she had not seen the brief uncertainty in Moon Hall, she might have believed he felt none of this. Elder Sira remained standing by the records table. She did not bow, Kale noticed. The clerks noticed that mattered too. The Western key set, Kale said, laying the black iron ring on the table. Boundary markers, gate authority, archive seals. Lyra signed one more line before looking up. How generous, his jaw tightened. The transfer is lawful. Yes, she said, that's the part upsetting everyone. The older clerk, perhaps sensing imminent danger, muttered something about inventory and nearly fled the room. The second followed, good instincts. Kale remained, that less wise. Lyra set down the pen. Did you come here to ensure I signed properly, or is there another public stage planned for the day? A flicker crossed his expression. Anger, maybe. Or the first sting of shame translated into defensiveness before he knew how to hold it. I came because Moonfall isn't a reward, he said. It's a ruin on an unstable borderline attached to a legal mechanism no one has activated in decades. And yet you still rejected me publicly without checking whether the law around it was dead enough to stay buried. That is not what happened. Lyra laughed softly. No, then tell me what happened, Alpha. Kale held her gaze. For one heartbeat she thought he might actually do it. Tell the truth. tell some part of it. Instead, he said, "What happened is that Nightfang cannot afford weakness in its alliances." There it was. Not remorse, just politics dressed as inevitability. Lyra's expression changed, not visibly for most people, but Elder Sira saw it. The old woman's grip tightened on her staff. "You had a chance," Lyra said quietly. "A tiny one, to be honest, and you chose strategy again." Kale's voice hardened. "I chose the pack." "No," Lyra said. "You chose the version of the pack that keeps you comfortable at the top of it." The words landed. And instead of denying them, Kale made the mistake that would keep her angry at him for much longer than one public rejection alone might have. He doubled down. "You are not prepared for Moonfall," he said. "You do not understand what it is, what it contains, or what its claim will attract. You have spent your life inside kitchens and infirmaries. That is not an insult, it is fact." Lyra went perfectly still. Because yes, it was factual on the surface, and that made it uglier. This was how men like Kale hurt people best, not with loud lies, with partial truths weaponized into hierarchy. "You're right," she said. "I have spent my life in kitchens, infirmaries, storage rooms, archive corners, and all the places powerful men go when they want food, healing, records, or information without noticing the women standing close enough to hear them." Kale's gaze sharpened. "Too late, and now," she went on, "the servant who learned in all those rooms owns a fortress your council forgot how to control. That must be very uncomfortable for you." Elder Sira did not bother hiding the approval in her eyes this time. Kale looked at the old lawkeeper. "You encouraged this." Sira answered without hesitation. "No, I failed to prevent the conditions that made it necessary." That silenced him. Lyra signed the final transfer line, lifted the seal, and pressed it to the wax. The sound of the stamp hitting paper felt heavier than it should have. Done. Nightfang could never unmake the claim quietly now. Kale picked up the key ring and held it out. "Moonfall's gate keys." Lyra took them. The iron was colder than the room. Their fingers brushed. The bond flared, damaged and furious, and she felt him react before he concealed it. "Good, let pain educate where conscience had been slow." "I expect you back before dusk tomorrow," Kale said. Lyra blinked. "What?" "Moonfall will be transferred. The legal box is checked. But you are not sleeping there until I send a proper guard and have the western line assessed." For 1 second, she simply stared at him. Then she laughed, a sound without warmth. "You publicly reject me, lose control of the law, and your first instinct afterward is still to tell me where I'm allowed to sleep?" His expression darkened. "This is not about rank, it is about safety." "No," Lyra said. "It is about control. That's unfair." "Unfair?" Her voice sharpened for the first time. "You humiliate me before the pack and then try to manage the consequences as if I'm a difficult afterthought in your military plan. Do you hear yourself?" Kale's answer came faster than wisdom. "You don't know what you're walking into. And you don't know what you're standing in," Lyra shot back. "That's what made last night possible." She stepped around him. "Lyra," the way he said her name now almost sounded human. She hated that too. She turned only halfway. "If you had wanted authority over me, Alpha, you should have remembered that rejection severs more than sentiment." Then she walked out. Kale did not stop her, but he watched. That she felt between her shoulder blades all the way to the western gate. By sunset, Lyra was leaving Nightfang with 2 wagons, 4 newly released Detomegas who had chosen to follow her, Tomas the former record steward, and 3 law-assigned guards whose discomfort at being ordered by a former servant was almost funny enough to enjoy. Almost, at the gate, Myrle Voss was waiting. Not in white this time. In riding leathers, her dark hair braided back, expression composed into something too elegant to be called hostility, even though hostility was absolutely present. The guards immediately tensed. Tomas muttered something under his breath about omens wearing perfume. Myrle ignored all of them and looked directly at Lyra. "Are you really going?" Lyra considered the question. "No, I'm staging a symbolic wagon parade for morale." A tiny movement touched Myrle's mouth. Not amusement exactly, recognition of nerve. "Moonfall is not abandoned because no one wanted it," Myrle said. Lyra narrowed her eyes. "Then why?" Myrle glanced once toward the keep behind them, toward the council windows, and lowered her voice. because everyone who wanted it understood the price attached. That was not enough. It was also more warning than Lyra expected from her. Why tell me? Myrle's gaze sharpened. Because if you think I enjoy being moved around like a white-clothed symbol while men negotiate territory through my name, then you understand less about this pack than I gave you credit for. Interesting. Lyra said nothing. Myrle stepped closer, not enough to imply intimacy, only enough to ensure no guard could hear clearly. My father does not fear weak women, Myrle said. He fears women the law can't dismiss. If Moonfall answered your claim, then you are now the most dangerous kind. Is this concern? Lyra asked. Myrle's eyes cooled. No, this is self-interest. If you die conveniently, I become useful to my father again in ways I no longer enjoy imagining. Then she added after a beat, also Kale was a fool. I dislike being placed near fools when they're making history. That almost made Lyra smile. Almost. Thank you for the insult and the warning, she said. Myrle stepped back. Don't mistake one for the other. Then Lyra climbed into the lead wagon, and Nightfang's gates opened behind her like the jaws of something she had survived but not finished reckoning with. Kale stood on the wall above as she left. He did not call her back. He did not apologize. He watched her ride toward a fortress she had claimed from him while still believing, somewhere deep in the arrogant center of himself, that he would be able to contain what happened next. He was wrong. Moonfall rose out of mountain, mist like a memory that had refused to die politely. Black stone, broken towers, ivy thick as old grief. One gate hanging crooked on iron hinges as if the keep had been trying for years to decide whether it wanted visitors or vengeance. The moment Lyra stepped through the outer arch with the black iron keys in her hand, the whole place answered. The torches flared blue. A low pulse rolled up through the stone into her feet. The dry fountain in the courtyard shuddered once, then spilled clear water in a sudden rush as if embarrassed by its own long silence. Mara gasped. One of the guards swore. Tomas dropped to one knee with tears standing stupidly in his old eyes. Lyra stood in the center of the ruined yard and felt something ancient turn toward her. Not hostile, not kind, recognizing, welcome home. She did not hear the words with her ears. She felt them in her bones. Moonfall's first gift was authority. Its first price arrived the same night. The keep responded to intent. That sounded glorious until she discovered what it actually meant. When she ordered the main hall fires lit and meant the words only practically, 3 hearths caught at once. When she told Joran to lock the outer grain room and spoke with urgency sharpened by fear, the iron bolt sealed so hard it took 2 men and a crowbar to open it again. When Mara jokingly swore she would never abandon Lyra to Nightfang's mercy after all this, the skin at Mara's wrist flashed silver for half a heartbeat. By the 3rd strange incident, Tomas was pale. By the 5th, Lyra understood enough to be unsettled. Moonfall did not simply hear words. It weighed intent behind them. On its land, oath, command, and emotion tangled more tightly than ordinary speech had any right to. Which meant a frightened ruler could become a dangerous one very quickly. That realization should have made Lyra cautious. Instead, what she felt first was relief. Power that obeyed her, locks that answered her. A place where command did not automatically belong to men built wider than she was. After a life of being overlooked, that kind of response was intoxicating. That was exactly why it frightened Tomas so much. By the 2nd day, he found the lower archive chamber hidden behind a collapsed west wall. Behind it were sealed ledgers, old land maps, and correspondence tied to the Vale line. Lyra read until her eyes burned. There was no clean murder order for her parents. No single page that said we killed them and took what was theirs. The real world almost never offers villains that courtesy. What the records showed instead was worse. Transfer drafts prepared too early. Resource reallocations filed before morning ended. Emergency labor assignments stretched long past their lawful period. A chain of administrative convenience so smooth it could only have been deliberate. Her family had not merely died. Their loss had been harvested. By the time Lyra set down the last ledger, anger sat so steadily in her chest it felt almost calm. That was when she made her first real mistake. A guard named Halden Nightfangborn, assigned under law to escort the transfer, was caught trying to copy one of the Western ledgers for an unnamed recipient back east. Maybe for the council. Maybe for Kale. Maybe for someone worse. Lyra did not ask enough questions. She was tired, angry, newly powerful, and for one dangerous moment she confused certainty with justice. She had him brought into Moonfall's inner hall, under the old moon crest. With Tomas, Myra, and the other guards watching. "Who are you sending the copy to?" Lyra asked. Halden said nothing. Sweat stood at his temples, not because of guilt alone, because the hall felt different now, charged, listening. "I asked you a question." Still nothing. And then Lyra, aching from too many years of being the one people lied around, spoke in anger on land that answered anger. "By claim and keep you will answer." The words hit the room like thrown iron. Silver lines flashed across the floor. Halden dropped to his knees with a scream, not blood, not visible injury. But whatever Moonfall did to enforce truth, it hurt. Mara gasped and backed away. Tomas went white. Even the other guards looked horrified. Halden choked out the answer immediately. The copy had been meant for Counselor Bren. The council wanted eyes inside Moonfall before Lyra understood what full possession might mean. Lyra should have been satisfied. Instead, she looked at the man writhing on the floor and heard, too late, the echo inside her own command. "By claim and keep you will answer." She had not asked, she had compelled. The room felt colder afterward, not because the fires died, because everyone present had learned that Moonfall could turn her anger into law if she spoke carelessly enough. That night Tomas came to her chamber with a cup of tea and no fear left in his voice, which somehow made what he said worse. "Lady," he said gently, "if this keep gives you the power to make obedience feel righteous, you must become careful long before that starts feeling natural." Lyra stared into the cup without drinking. "You think I frightened them?" "I think you frightened yourself." He was right, that was the problem. Power felt safest to people who had lived without it. And safety was exactly what Lyra had been denied for so long that she was dangerously close to confusing control with healing. Before she could sit with that truth properly, hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Nightfang rider, fast, urgent. When Lyra stepped onto the west balcony, Beta Rowan looked up and did not waste breath on ceremony. "Message from the Alpha," he called. Lyra descended, took the sealed letter, broke it open. "Lyra, Red Hollow scouts are moving through the eastern line. This is not rumor. They are searching for Moonfall specifically. Leave the keep now or reinforce it immediately. There are things under Moonfall I should have told you sooner. We need to talk before Darius makes the first move." Kale Lyra read it once, then again. Then folded it with careful, growing fury. "There are things under Moonfall I should have told you sooner." Of course there were. Of course Kale Thorne still had truths to drip out only when crisis made concealment inconvenient. "What things?" she asked Rowan. His silence answered too much. Lyra's temper rose, Moonfall hummed under the floor, the windows rattled. She took one sharp breath and forced her voice flat. "Tell your Alpha," she said, "that if he wanted trust before war, he should have tried honesty before rejection." Rowan's expression tightened. "Lyra, no, if he has information, he can bring it himself. Plainly, not in scraps. Not when he thinks I've become desperate enough to listen." By midnight, shadowed movement was visible beyond the lower tree line. The war had not reached Moonfall yet, but it was close enough now that the keep could smell it. And Lyra, newly powerful and newly afraid of what that power might make easy, stood on the western wall and understood that from here on, every decision would test not just whether she could survive, but what survival would turn her into. Myril Voss arrived at Moonfall 2 nights before the first attack. Alone, unescorted, which was either madness or confidence severe enough to imitate it. She came just after dusk while sleet hissed against the outer stones. The guards nearly refused her entry until Lyra, watching from the upper gallery, recognized the white wolf crest on her riding cloak. Every instinct she possessed said send her away. Every survival habit she had built said people rarely ride alone into hostile territory without either a lie or a truth worth hearing. So Lyra admitted her. Myril entered the upper hall without apology. Travel dirt streaked the hem of her cloak. Her braid had come half loose. She looked less like a perfect political bride tonight and more like what she actually was under all that elegance. Someone trained too young to survive among powerful men without ever letting them see fear. Tomas withdrew. Mara didn't. Mara would have gladly stayed and eavesdropped from a chandelier if given the option. Lyra sent her out anyway. The two women faced each other across the long oak table in the hall where Moonfall's ward fire burned blue in the wall sconces. "You came alone," Lyra said. Myrle removed her gloves finger by finger. "If I brought my father's men, you'd assume I came as bait. If I brought Nightfang escorts, Kale would hear of it before I finished dismounting. This was cleaner. Nothing about you has ever been clean." That should have offended her. Instead, Myrle smiled without humor. "Good, I was worried winning Moonfall might have made you generous." Lyra crossed her arms. "Say what you came to say." Myrle's expression shifted. Not softer, sharper, more real. "My father intends to take Moonfall before the first winter snow locks the ridge roads," she said. "Not because he wants your land taxes. Because he thinks what's under it should never belong to a Luna line again." That answer was more interesting than Lyra expected. "Again?" Myrle looked toward the windows where the sleet scratched at stone. "You know the stories your law books preserve. You probably don't know the ones our fathers whisper after too much wine. About the old Luna houses. About packs split by succession claims no alpha could control. About bonded territories that chose women who ruled by oath instead of force and nearly dragged every neighboring line into civil war." Lyra studied her. "You believe that?" "I believe my father does," Myrle said. "And men like him are most dangerous when they think cruelty is maintenance." That line sounded practiced, not rehearsed exactly, lived in. Lyra leaned one hip against the table. "Why help me?" Myrle's mouth thinned. "Because if he can't control you, he will try to use me. Again." Silence. There it was, the crack beneath the polished rival. Not friendship, not sudden sisterhood. Just shared understanding of what it meant to be positioned, bargained, and evaluated by men who treated daughters and mates as political architecture. Lyra did not soften, but she listened more carefully. "My father planned the alliance with Nightfang months before the bond," Myrle said. "Kale was valuable because he was strong enough to stabilize western borders and young enough to be maneuvered by fear of losing that stability. Then you appeared." "Appeared?" Lyra repeated coldly. "I was already there." Myrle met her gaze. "Exactly, that was part of the problem. You were close enough to matter and low enough in rank that powerful men assumed they could erase you without consequence. That, at least, was true." "Did you want him?" Lyra asked. Myrle laughed softly. "I wanted what standing beside an alpha like Kale would have allowed me to become." That answer was more honest than love and therefore more dangerous. Which was untouchable. The word hung between them. Lyra understood it immediately, not because she had ever been untouchable, because she had spent her whole life wanting exactly the same thing and calling it survival. Myrle looked at the blue ward fire in the sconces. "Do you know why I disliked you the first night I saw you after the bond?" Lyra raised a brow. "Because I existed." "That too, but mostly because you looked at Kale like he had hurt you before he ever actually did." That stung. "Mostly because it might have been true. He hadn't rejected you yet," Myrle continued. "But I could already see you understood something about him I had only begun to suspect. He would choose duty before tenderness every time if forced quickly enough." Lyra's voice cooled. "And yet you still stood beside him in white." Myrle's eyes flashed. "Of course I did. Women raised in cages don't always leave the day the door opens. Sometimes they've forgotten what outside is supposed to look like." That shut Lyra up, momentarily. Then she said, "If you came here for absolution, you'll leave disappointed." Myrle gave a small, hard smile. "Good, I'd hate to think public humiliation made you foolish." They looked at each other a long time after that. Not friends, not allies exactly, but no longer simple enemies either. Finally, Myrle reached into her cloak and slid a folded paper across the table. Lyra opened it. It was a rough movement map. Red Hollow scouting lines, eastern ridge markers, estimated ravine approaches, and one circled notation in Myrle's precise hand. "He will not attack where he is loudest. He will attack where he thinks women will not anticipate him." Lyra looked up slowly. You stole this. Myra lifted one shoulder. No. I borrowed it from a man arrogant enough to leave strategy within reach of a daughter he thought already obedient. Lyra almost smiled. Almost. If Kale asks, Myra said, pulling on her gloves again, tell him nothing. He still hasn't fully learned the difference between information and trust. That, again, was true. At the door she paused. My father is wrong about one thing, she said without turning back. Lyra waited. He thinks women become dangerous only when they are given power. Myrle's voice sharpened. Men like him never understand that women become most dangerous when they have already survived power without it. Then she left. Lyra stood alone in the blue-lit hall with the stolen map in one hand and a more complicated enemy in the rear view than she had expected. Myrle was still capable of betrayal, still ambitious, still dangerous. But danger was not the same thing as villainy. That mattered, because simple enemies make simple stories. And Lyra was beginning to understand she no longer lived inside one. They came before dawn, not in formation, not with drums. Red Hollow sent its first strike the way intelligent predators test fences, with scouts, climbers, and men sharp enough to spot weakness without wasting strength. Moonfall sensed them before the guards did. The fountain water shivered, the upper torches dropped low, the west bell rang once and cut off. Lyra was on the wall before the second horn, map in hand, hair half braided. Fury and adrenaline making the world painfully clear. Myrle's stolen notes matched what she saw in the dark below. A small team toward the east, a probing line at the postern, and the real danger circling north through the drainage cut. Lyra gave orders, the guards obeyed. That still unsettled her every time. Shift the archers from the south to the north shelf, she said. Leave enough movement on the main approach that they think we're defending the obvious route harder. Tomas appeared beside her, clutching a half-buttoned coat. You're sure? No, Lyra said. I'm fast. It was not confidence. It was the habit of people who know hesitation kills quicker than imperfect certainty. The first breach attempt hit the postern gate, a ram, crude but effective. The second came from the north slope where 3 climbers used the old drainage rock to scale toward the lower ward passage. Lyra split the response. For 10 minutes it worked. Moonfall's old iron teeth rose from the west choke. Archers pinned 2 climbers. Mara nearly lost her mind and then discovered she could reload a crossbow on sheer panic alone. Then one of the northern guards screamed. A red hollow wolf had gotten through the half-sealed passage, not a commander. Not important enough to matter strategically. But he was inside. And after a life of being acted upon, the sight of a hostile body inside her keep snapped something in Lyra she did not yet know how to govern. She reached for Moonfall the way a drowning person reaches for rope. Only this rope was old law, blood claim, and dangerous obedience. Stop him, she ordered the keep itself. The stone floor beneath the intruder flashed silver. He dropped with a convulsion so violent the sound of it sickened everyone in the corridor. Not dead, not exactly. Pinned, burning, trapped in an invisible hold while he screamed, the other guards stared at Lyra. Not with gratitude, with fear. Even Lyra froze, because the command had obeyed too easily, too harshly, too much like the kind of power men always swore women could not be trusted with. The intruder gasped out surrender almost at once. The corridor reeked of ozone and panic. Mara backed away until she hit the wall. Lady, Tomas whispered. Lyra knew what he had not said. That was not justice. That was force wearing authority's face. Then Kale arrived. Not because romance demanded it. Because Rowan had ridden hard through the snow line, the second Red Hollow's patterns turned from scouting to engagement, and Kale, who had finally begun to understand what his delay had already cost, moved Nightfang's nearest fighters before council approval could slow him. He entered through the main gate with Rowan and 8 wolves just as Lyra stood in the corridor staring at the twitching red hollow intruder pinned by the floor's silver lines. Kale took in the scene in one glance. The trapped attacker. The terrified guards, Lyra's expression. And for the first time since Moon Hall, he looked at her not with anger, not with strategy, but with recognition of danger that did not come from outside. Release him, he said quietly. Lyra turned on him so fast Rowan stepped forward by instinct. Don't command me in my own keep. Kale didn't flinch. Then hear me as someone who has already watched power become cruelty under the excuse of necessity. Release him before this place teaches you the wrong lesson. That hit because it was true and she hated that it came from him. For 1 second, pride almost made her refuse. That was the most dangerous second in the corridor. Not the attack, not the blood, not the intruder. That second. The one where being right earlier tempted her into believing every later impulse must also be righteous. Lyra swallowed hard and forced the command out. Let him go. The silver lines vanished. The intruder collapsed weeping and was hauled away in chains. The fight ended 20 minutes later. Red Hollow's first strike failed, but the damage was done, not to the walls, to Lyra. She had felt how easy it would be to make Moonfall obey her fear. And she had seen how quickly that obedience could turn other people's eyes on her into something colder than trust. Kale approached her in the courtyard afterward while snow drifted through torch smoke. You hesitated because you knew, he said. Lyra's laugh was ugly. Do not sound relieved. You're one of the reasons I wanted control that badly. His face tightened. I know. Do you? She snapped. Do you understand what happens to a woman who has spent her entire life being moved, used, watched, and overruled the second something finally answers her? Kale held her gaze. Not fully, but I understand enough to know control can feel like safety when you've been denied both. The truth of it made her angrier, not less. You don't get to be insightful after becoming one of the men who taught me that lesson. I know, that answer again. No defense, no excuse. Only knowledge sharp enough to hurt him too. Good, it should. Because Kale Thorne was only beginning to understand that the price of his public rejection had not simply been land. It had also been this. Watching the woman he hurt come into power in a way dangerous enough that he could no longer protect her from the worst possible thing. Herself, if she used it wrong. Kale should have told her everything that night. He didn't. That was his next failure. And because the story is better when men remain accountable for patterns instead of earning redemption through one good conversation, that failure mattered. After the attack, after the corridor incident, after he saw Moonfall respond to Lyra's fear like a weapon too eager to please, Kale brought maps, records, and a partial truth. Not the full one. He told her about the Moonwell. He told her Moonfall's old Luna laws were tied to a subterranean source of lunar binding force. He told her Darius wanted access to it because old border compacts anchored there could alter regional power. He told her the Keep had likely recognized her bloodline and would continue responding more strongly now that she had claimed it publicly. All of that was true. He did not tell her the most dangerous part. Not yet. He did not tell her that his father's council had once considered using a Vale blood claimant to stabilize Moonfall under controlled marriage. He did not tell her that old notes suggested the Moonwell did more than empower a ruler. It judged one, and if the claimant failed its standard, Moonfall could bind itself in warped loyalty to their worst impulses. Kale kept that part back because he was afraid. Afraid she would run headlong into the trial out of anger. Afraid she would resent the warning because it came from him. Afraid that if he confessed how much Nightfang had already known and hidden, whatever fragile chance remained for influence would die before he could use it to keep her alive. He told himself it was caution. It was still control wearing a cleaner coat. Lyra sensed it immediately. She had lived too long among partial truths not to. They stood in Moonfall's archive room while Rowan and Tomas waited outside with enough distance to pretend they were not listening. Rain hammered the shutters. The Keep's blue wardfire painted pale light over Kale's face. You're still editing, Lyra said. Kale's jaw tightened. I told you what matters. No, she said. You told me what you've decided I can manage hearing tonight. That isn't. It is exactly that. The accusation struck because it was accurate. Kale looked away. Wrong move, Lyra saw it. What are you still not saying? Kale hesitated. And in that hesitation, she heard the echo of Moonfall all over again, the instant where power chooses itself first. Kale, he answered too late to make it harmless. There are older notes suggesting Moonfall's full claim cannot settle until the Moonwell trial accepts its ruler. Lyra's expression did not change. That frightened him more than anger. "And," she asked, he exhaled, "and if the trial judges the claimant unfit? And it can intensify whatever motive the ruler is carrying strongest. Fear, hunger, vengeance, control." Silence. Then Lyra smiled, not kindly, not even mockingly, with the terrible precision of someone who had just caught the shape of another omission. "How long," she asked softly, "were you planning to keep that from me?" Kale stepped forward instinctively. "Long enough to stop you from entering the chamber angry." There it was, not redemption. Pattern. Lyra looked like he had slapped her a second time, not because the fact was horrifying. Because he still believed, somewhere deep in himself, that withholding truth could count as care if the intention behind it felt protective enough. "You still don't understand," she whispered. Kale's throat tightened. "Lyra, no." Now the anger came, cold and clean. "You keep thinking the problem is how much you hurt me. It isn't. The problem is that even after seeing what your choices cost, you still instinctively reach for the right to decide what I should know in order to make the decision you want me to make." He had no answer, not one that didn't damn him. "I thought you had changed," she said. "I am trying to." "That is not the same thing." Kale closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them again, there was no defense left. Only truth harsh enough to strip him bare. "No," he said, "it isn't." That honesty might have helped if it had come before the hesitation. Afterward, it only made the damage clearer. Lyra turned away from him and walked to the far end of the archive where the old Western map hung. When she spoke again, her voice was steady enough to scare him. "I'm still taking the trial." Kale went still. "In this state? In what state?" "In pain," he said, angry, distrustful, carrying too much at once. Lyra turned back slowly. "Now you want me to delay because I might fail a test that reflects the strongest thing inside me." "Yes," she laughed once. "Then maybe the stronger truth is that if I wait until I am pure enough for men to stop fearing me, I will never claim anything at all." He stared at her. She went on. "I am angry," she said. "I am frightened by what this keep can do. I am furious with you. I am still hurt by what happened in Moonhall. Those things do not make me unfit, they make me honest." Kale stepped toward her again and stopped himself this time. Small progress, still not enough. "If the well reflects control," he said carefully, "then your greatest risk isn't anger. It's the belief that if you can hold everything tightly enough, no one can ever choose your pain for you again." That landed. Because it was the truth she had not wanted spoken aloud. Lyra looked away, just once. Just long enough for him to know he had found the bruise under the armor. Then she faced him again and said, "And your greatest risk is still believing that naming my wounds gives you the right to shape my decisions around them." He nodded. Yes, the simple acceptance of that should not have mattered as much as it did. It did anyway. "Then here is what happens next," Lyra said. "I enter the Moonwell tomorrow at dusk, not because you approve. Because Moonfall will keep attracting blood until its claim is settled. If I fail, that failure will be mine. If I pass, the keep answers to me more fully than it does now." Kale's face hardened with fear he was trying not to weaponize. "And if the well amplifies the wrong thing in you?" Lyra's answer came after a long pause. "Then I will need people near me who tell the truth before I become the kind of ruler who punishes honesty." He looked at her then with something almost unbearable in it. Not hope, permission, a role he might not deserve but was being told he could still choose to earn. "I can do that," he said. Lyra's expression sharpened. "No, you can try. And if you fail again, this keep will not be the only thing that remembers it." That was as much trust as he had earned, nothing more. The entrance to the Moonwell chamber opened at dusk. Moonfall's lower tower had not been used in generations. Dust coated the stair walls. Old carvings of crowned wolves and lunar marks glowed faintly under the light of Tomas's lantern, as if the stone had spent years conserving breath for this exact night. Only Lyra could enter. That was part of the old law. No witness, no protector, no mate, no counselor. Whatever claim the well-accepted had to be faced alone. Before she descended, Myril arrived again. That surprised everyone enough that Rowan nearly reached for his sword on instinct. But Myril only crossed the courtyard, stopped in front of Lyra, and held out a narrow silver chain. At the end hung a small obsidian wolf's tooth. For grounding, Myrle said. Lyra stared. You own grounding charms? I'm a noble daughter raised to smile at strategy while men decide the shape of my life. Of course I own grounding charms. That nearly drew a laugh. Nearly. Why give it to me? Myrle's face did something strange, less pride, more fatigue. Because if the keep makes you cruel, my father wins without taking a single wall. There it was, not affection, not alliance, understanding. Lyra accepted the charm. Thank you, Myrle's mouth twitched. Don't make me regret preferring you to him. Then she stepped back. Kale said nothing as Lyra approached the sealed door. That restraint mattered, she felt it. He wanted to warn, persuade, intervene. Instead, he let her choose and stood still enough to prove he understood the importance of that. Lyra placed her palm to the stone. The door split soundlessly. Moonlight spilled upward from below, though the sky above was fully clouded. The stair wound down into cold silver silence. Each step stripped something from the ordinary world, the noise of wind, the smell of torch smoke, the weight of being watched. By the time Lyra reached the chamber floor, she felt as if she had stepped into the inside of old law itself. At the center lay the Moonwell, a basin of liquid silver light, neither water nor flame. Around it rose statues of ancient Luna claimants in stone crowns, their faces severe, intelligent, and completely unimpressed by the fact that future generations had let men act as if they alone had built wolf law. The door sealed behind her, the voice came from everywhere. Claimant of Moonfall, name yourself. Lyra Vale, bloodline, daughter of Lyra Vale, daughter of the Western Line, daughter of Moonfall. By what right do you claim? Lyra's throat tightened. She could feel the bond wound, Kale's rejection, her parents' ghosts, her own ambition, her own fear, everything was present. There was no leaving parts of herself outside this chamber. By blood, she said, by witness. By law, by the fact that what was taken from us never became cleaner because powerful men held it longer. The well rose, the trial began. It did not test strength first, it tested narrative. The chamber filled with memory, not only hers, Moonfall's, a Luna standing on the battlements while men below called her too ruthless. Another sitting over treaty ledgers while neighboring alphas whispered that divided power always invited civil war. A woman in blood-stained white commanding the western gates while the mate beside her begged her to abandon the keep and save only the bloodline. Then Lyra, her mother, arguing with Kale's father in the old archive. You call it stewardship, Lyra said. I call it theft under mourning cloth. Kale's father answered, I call it preventing chaos. The border cannot be left in female inheritance uncertainty while wolves still die on the line. That sentence tells me everything I need to know about the sort of peace you intend. The vision shifted. Now Darius Voss stood in some old council chamber, younger but no softer. Around him were maps and casualty records from ancient succession wars. He pointed to burned territories and said, Luna-sealed border claims have started more blood than rogue packs ever did. You let emotional legitimacy outrank centralized command, and the mountain line fractures every generation. Then another shift, Kale in private after the bonds snapped. Not noble, afraid, not of Lyra herself. Of what needing her would cost his control. Then the well turned cruel. It showed Lyra futures. In one, she used Moonfall's oath binding to command absolute loyalty from everyone around her. The keep grew stronger. So did the fear in every room she entered. No one lied to her again because no one dared speak freely at all. In another, she destroyed Nightfang's council publicly and watched wolves cheer, while new wolves quietly learned that power had only changed hands, not nature. In another, she used law to punish so aggressively that justice curdled into domination, and Moonfall became exactly what Darius had always feared, a Luna throne held together by compelled obedience. Lyra staggered. That more than anything shook her, not the idea that she could fail, the idea that she could become effective in exactly the wrong direction and still call herself righteous. What do you truly seek? The chamber asked. Lyra forced herself upright. I seek an end to theft. Not enough, she swallowed. I seek safety that isn't built out of someone else's humiliation. Not enough. The silver light rose higher. Pressure built around her. The well wanted the dangerous truth, not the polished one, so Lyra gave it. "I seek control," she said hoarsely, "because control feels like the only thing humiliation can't touch." The chamber stilled. There it was, the rod in her too, not evil, not yet, but real. "And I know that terrifies me," she said, "because if all I wanted was revenge, at least the shape would be simple. But I want to build a world where no one can do to another girl what was done to me, and part of me wants to make that world impossible to disobey." The silence deepened. Then the silver figure rose from the well. A crowned woman made of moonlight and memory, her face shifting between unknown ancestresses and Lyra's mother. "That is the edge," the figure said. "Not pain, not anger, the temptation to confuse certainty with justice." One hand showed vengeance. A world where Lyra ruled by fear and called it protection. No one could hurt her there. No one could leave either. The others showed burden. A world where law remained hard, open, accountable, and therefore risky. A world where she would have to tolerate uncertainty, argument, dissent, and the possibility of being disappointed again, because power had not been turned into a cage. "If you claim Moonfall," the figure said, "you do not become safe from your flaws. You become answerable to them." Lyra closed her eyes. She thought of the corridor where Halden screamed under her command. She thought of how good control had felt for one terrible second. She thought of Mara and Tomas and the freed wolves who had followed her because she opened a door, not because she promised to lock the world from the inside after entering. When she opened her eyes again, she knew the answer. "I claim Moonfall," she said, "not because I am beyond corruption, but because I am willing to be judged whenever I move too close to it." The crowned figure smiled, accepted. The well exploded into silver light. It passed through Lyra like ice, fire, and memory all at once. Her wolf rose inside her for the first time, not as delayed weakness, but as chosen force. Not louder than her, aligned with her. And with the power came the price. A mark seared itself along her inner wrist in the shape of a crescent crossed by a line. The figure's final words entered her like law: "Command in rage, and the keep will remember. Rule in fear, and the keep will become what you are." When Lyra climbed the stairs back into Moonfall, every torch in the keep flared silver. The walls hummed. The gates answered her presence. And Kale, seeing the mark on her wrist and the changed power in her eyes, understood before anyone said it aloud. Moonfall had accepted her, but it had not accepted her cheaply. The full attack came 2 days after the trial. This time Red Hollow did not send scouts. It sent an argument with teeth. Darius Voss came under banners with enough force to make retreat the sensible choice if Lyra had been any kind of leader other than the one Moonfall had chosen. He requested parley before battle. That alone made Rowan distrust him more. Lyra accepted. Not because she trusted him, because smart villains often expose more when they think their logic will impress the person they intend to crush. The meeting took place at the lower valley edge between lines. Snow drifted over black rock. Nightfang reinforcements stood behind Kale's command ridge. Moonfall guards lined the upper approach. Darius rode forward alone, silver at his temples, black cloak unmarked by fear. He looked at Lyra and smiled with something almost like respect. "So," he said, "the old keep still choose stubborn girls." Lyra did not return the smile. "And some men still mistake theft for statecraft." Darius inclined his head slightly. "Sometimes they are the same thing. The difference is whether history rewards the thief with stability." There it was, not cartoon evil. Philosophy sharpened into excuse. Kale stepped half a pace closer to Lyra. Darius noticed and smiled wider. "You see," Darius said, "this is what I've warned about for years. The old Luna lines never merely inherit. They rearrange loyalties around themselves. Borders shift. Mates become liabilities. Councils fracture. Men who should think like rulers begin thinking like lovers." Kale's hand flexed once at his side. Lyra answered first. "Men who should think like rulers often mean men who prefer no one alive can overrule them." Darius's gaze sharpened. "And what do you prefer?" Lyra lifted her marked wrist. "Law that binds everyone, not just the weak." For the first time, Darius's expression actually cooled. "You think law restrains power," he said. "Your mother thought that too. She died proving otherwise." Pain flickered through Lyra. Darius saw it and pressed harder. The Luna lines caused 3 succession wars along the mountain territories, he said. Do you know how many villages burned because rulers claimed mystical legitimacy over practical command? Do you know how many children buried their parents while poets called it sacred balance? That landed because it was not entirely false. The well had shown her enough to know he was weaponizing history, not inventing it from nothing. That was what made him dangerous. A villain who can only lie is simple. A villain who builds his cruelty around selected truth is much harder to defeat. I know the mountain line bled, Lyra said. I also know men like you retell that history as if centralized alpha power was peace instead of a better branded monopoly on violence. Darius laughed softly. You are smarter than I hoped. That changes nothing. No, because intelligence is not what decides which systems survive. Force does. Then he looked past her to Kale. And he knows I'm right, that's why he rejected you. The valley went silent. Kale stepped forward, but Lyra stopped him with one glance. Not because Darius was right in the way he meant, because this was the center of the conflict and no one else was going to speak for her inside it again. Yes, Lyra said. He rejected me because he chose control over truth. You, on the other hand, want to own the future so completely that no one will ever be allowed to challenge the kind of order that made that choice possible. Darius smiled. Exactly, now you're learning. Kale's voice came cold as winter iron. She understands you, don't mistake that for agreement. Darius looked at him with open contempt. You could have been stronger than your father, instead you became guilty. That's a poor substitute. Maybe it was. Maybe guilt was weaker than certainty. But Lyra had started to suspect guilt, if acted on properly, was far more useful than a man who believed himself clean. The parley ended without resolution because of course it did. Men like Darius do not come to be persuaded. They come to confirm where resistance is strongest and how to break it. As he turned his horse back toward Red Hollow's lines, he called over his shoulder. When your keep starts demanding more than justice, girl, remember that I warned you what old power does to women who mistake inheritance for destiny. Lyra watched him ride away and hated how much of his warning touched the same fear the Moonwell had already shown her. That was the shape of the war now, not just walls, not just armies, but competing visions of what power did to wounded people. And Kale, standing beside her, was still not done paying for the fact that he had once made himself part of the more destructive answer. The battle for Moonfall began at first light. Red Hollow hit the south wall with noise and force, exactly where Rowan expected. The real objective unit moved north toward the lower well corridor, exactly where Lyra expected. This time, though, she did not let herself command from panic. That was the difference the Moonwell mark burned into her wrist whenever she reached too fast for control. Every time anger rose, the mark warmed. A warning, not punishment yet. Warning, she used it, not as restraint from power, but as restraint inside power. Hold the south enough to make them commit, she ordered. The north team waits until the inner ravine. Kale looked at her once, saw the way her fingers flexed against the map edge, saw the effort it took her not to reach for the keep itself too early, and said nothing. That silence was support now, not control. When Red Hollow's elite strike force entered the North Ravine, Moonfall triggered the first collapse lines. Rowan sealed the back route. Archers opened from above. Kale struck from the ridge flank with Nightfang's reserve. Darius adapted immediately. He always did. That was why he was dangerous. He did not rely on one route when another appeared. He cut for the inner stair instead and sent a smaller team toward the ward chamber beneath the old tower. West Lower Hall, Tomas shouted. Lyra ran. The fight at the ward chamber became the story people would repeat for years. Not because it was the bloodiest, because it was the moment Lyra nearly lost herself and chose not to. Darius's men broke through the first gate. One of Moonfall's guards went down. Mara had blood on her cheek and a broken spear in her hand. The lower hall narrowed into stone choke points slick with melted snow and boot mud. Kale was still above, locked with Darius's main line. Rowan was 2 corridors away. The ward chamber doors were cracking. Lyra reached for Moonfall. The keep surged toward her instantly. Too eagerly. Like a beast that had learned, she sometimes wanted fear to become obedience. One command and she could have dropped every intruder in the corridor, maybe broken them, maybe bound them, maybe done worse. The crescent mark on her wrist burned hot, a warning, command in rage and the keep will remember. She heard Darius's voice in memory. Old power does things to women who mistake inheritance for destiny. She heard Kale's too. Control can feel like safety. And then, in the middle of battle, with stones shaking around her and enemies pushing forward, Lyra understood the real heart of this war. Darius believed women should never hold power like this because pain would make them tyrants. Men like him then used that fear as justification to keep the power for themselves. If she proved him right, even once, his whole worldview won, not because he took Moonfall, because he would have been correct about what power made of the wounded. Lyra lowered her hand. Instead of commanding the keep to break the attackers, she ordered the corridor grates shut, the side wall release triggered, and the upper ash chute opened. Simple, mechanical, strategic, not soul-binding. The corridor flooded with blinding cinder dust. The grates slammed down. The lead attackers choked and lost formation. Mara rallied. Tomas triggered the secondary lock line. When Rowan arrived with two wolves from the flank, the breach collapsed without Moonfall ever forcing obedience from a single living mind. Later, Lyra would understand that was the real victory, not stopping the attack, choosing how. Above, Kale reached Darius on the upper ridge. Their fight was vicious and ugly and stripped of all ceremony. Darius fought like a man who believed history justified his brutality. Kale fought like a man trying to kill the version of power he had once served without understanding it. They would have destroyed each other if Lyra had not arrived when she did. Darius had Kale off balance, silver knife in one hand, blood running down his jaw, and he was smiling. "You still fight like a ruler trying to deserve mercy," Darius snarled. "That's why you lose women like her." Kale took the next blow to the ribs and nearly went down. The old version of Lyra might have reached for Moonfall and pinned Darius to the stone. The version standing there now chose something harder. She stepped between them, not foolishly, deliberately, blade in hand, mark burning at her wrist. Darius laughed. That's the problem with you Luna lines. Men bleed for you and you call it destiny." Lyra looked at him with a steadiness cold enough to quiet the mountain wind in her own ears. "No," she said, "men choose, and then they answer for what they choose." She didn't strike first, she let him lunge, then used his momentum, the slick ridge stone, and the half-collapsed parapet against him. Kale knocked the knife loose. Rowan's axe pinned Darius's cloak to the broken wall. Nightfang wolves swarmed him from behind. The valley battle faltered instantly. Red hollow banners began to break. Darius, chained and bleeding, looked up at Lyra and smiled through split lips. "You think sparing me would make you virtuous?" Lyra's eyes narrowed. "I think killing you cleanly would make a martyr out of a man too small for one," he laughed. "Then bind me, prove you can't resist." The mark on her wrist burned. The keep waited, everyone waited. Lyra looked at Kale, not for permission, for witness. Then she stepped back from Darius and said the thing no one expected. "Take him alive, strip his authority publicly. Let every pack hear the charges from his own mouth." That was worse than execution. Darius knew it. The shock on his face was almost worth the battle all by itself, because death is simple, exposure is not. Red Hollow retreated before sunset. Moonfall stood. And Kale Thorne, kneeling in blood and snow with his breath ragged and his eyes fixed on the woman he had once publicly discarded, finally understood something he should have learned months ago. Lyra had not become great because humiliation made her hard. She had become dangerous because pain had not yet convinced her to become small. Darius's public hearing was held in Moon Hall, the same hall where Kale had rejected Lyra, the same hall where the pack had gathered to watch her be humiliated, the same hall where old law had awakened and refused to die quietly. That was not an accident. Lyra chose the location deliberately, not for revenge, for symmetry. Some rooms deserve to remember exactly how they were used. Every elder came, every counselor, every major family. Servants lined the back walls under the excuse of carrying water and records, but no one bothered pretending they were there for the trays. They were there to witness the unraveling of a story Nightfang had told itself for years. Darius stood in chains under formal accusation, fraud by territorial coercion, interference in dormant claim succession, unauthorized strike against recognized Luna-held property, conspiracy tied to post-war land misappropriation, accessory knowledge in historical record suppression. The charges alone changed the air in the room, but that was not what made history. What made history was Kale. When Elder Sira called for witness on the question of Nightfang's role in enabling the situation, Kale stepped forward before the council could perform its usual dance of partial confession and collective vagueness. "I bear responsibility," he said. The room went dead still. Lyra felt the shift move through the hall like wind through dry grass. No Alpha said those words lightly. No one in Nightfang had ever heard Kale say them publicly in a way that implicated himself, not just a failed outcome. He continued, "I publicly rejected my fated mate knowing political pressure had already formed around her bloodline, and without first disclosing what I knew of Moonfall's irregular history. I chose pack optics, alliance stability, and my own belief in controlled outcomes over truth owed to the woman most affected." A counselor tried to interrupt. Sira silenced him with one look. Kale did not stop. That mattered too. He was not performing remorse. He was enduring consequence. "My rejection did not create every crime under review today," he said, voice steady, "but it was part of the same structure that assumed women, low-ranking wolves, and inherited claimants could be managed through partial truth, public pressure, and strategic humiliation." No one breathed. Lyra watched him from the side of the dais and felt something almost painful move under her ribs. Not forgiveness. Something more complicated. The recognition that he was finally paying not in private feeling, but in public cost. Kale then did the one thing no one expected. He removed the Alpha chain from around his shoulders and laid it on the stone step below the dais. Shock broke through the hall in a physical wave. Even Rowan looked shaken. "Until the Western inquiry is complete," Kale said, "I relinquish unilateral judgment over all territory disputes tied to Moonfall, the Vale Line, and post-war emergency authority. Nightfang's military command remains mine until challenge or council removal, but legal adjudication on these matters will proceed under Elder Seal and public record." It was not abdication. It was almost more powerful than that. An Alpha voluntarily limiting the reach of his own authority. Men like Darius would have called it weakness. Lyra knew better now. Sometimes the rarest strength is letting law stand over your pride instead of beneath it. Darius laughed once from his chains. "You break your own throne to impress her." Kale turned toward him. "No, I break your favorite lie. That power only survives by refusing witness." That was the moment the room turned against Darius completely. Not because everyone suddenly became noble, because the logic of men like him depends on powerful men never choosing accountability voluntarily. Once Kale did, Darius's certainty looked less like realism and more like appetite. The hearing lasted until evening. Evidence was read, testimony surfaced, old records were cross-sealed. Myrle testified too. That surprised nearly everyone except Lyra. Myrle did not pretend innocence. She admitted she knew the alliance was political. She admitted she ignored enough to stay comfortable inside it. She admitted she saw signs of her father's obsession with Moonfall and did not intervene until she realized she would become collateral if Lyra fell. It was not a redemption speech. It was better. It was ugly honesty. By the end, Darius Voss was stripped of recognized authority pending regional judgment, his allied claims frozen, his testimony copied for neighboring pack review. Nightfang's counsel did not leave that hall whole. Neither did Kale's image. That was the point. Afterward, when the hall emptied and the torch smoke thinned, Lyra stood alone near the crescent seal, where she had once smiled through a torn-open heart and made an Alpha pay. Kale approached slowly, no chain on his shoulders now, no ceremonial power marking his shape, just the man beneath it. "I told the truth," he said. "Yes. It cost me." "Yes," he almost smiled. "You are not generous with affirmation." Lyra finally looked at him. "You are not owed praise for arriving at decency late." That made him laugh softly. "Good. Let him still be human enough to laugh. Then his expression turned serious again. I'm not asking for forgiveness tonight. No, no, I'm asking if truth in public counts as the kind of payment that can at least let me stop paying from outside the gate. That was a better question. Still not an easy one. Lyra's voice softened only slightly. Payment isn't the same thing as trust. I know. Trust isn't the same thing as love. I know. Love isn't the same thing as fate. That one landed hardest. But Kale only nodded. I know. She studied him a long moment, then she said, good, because if there is any path forward for us, it begins with that distinction. That was not mercy, but it was no longer nothing. Winter settled fully over Moonfall after the hearings, not as ruin, as structure. The keep repaired, the ledgers copied, the freed workers redistributed into paid positions or resettled claims. Nightfang's Western order rewrote itself under more witness than it had ever tolerated before. And Kale changed in ways no speech alone could have proven. He came when summoned and stayed away when not. He answered directly when Lyra asked questions. He stopped presenting information as if timing belonged to him. He argued with her when he truly disagreed, which mattered more than empty agreement, but he no longer confused disagreement with the right to overrule. Most importantly, he accepted that remorse without structural change was just sorrow dressed as virtue. So he changed structure. Debt review boards opened. Council land protections narrowed. Emergency authority language was stripped from old legal frameworks. Public witness requirements were restored in cases touching bonded inheritance, territorial transfer, and labor reclassification. It was not romantic on the surface. That was what made it romantic in the deeper sense. A man undoing the conditions that once made his own cruelty feel practical. Myra left Red Hollow before spring, not in disgrace, not entirely. She claimed a maternal aunt's southern estate and began, to everyone's amazement, building a trade network that relied less on pack marriages and more on people owing her money directly. Lyra respected that almost against her will. Darius remained alive long enough to hear his influence dismantled region by region. That remained one of Lyra's better decisions. Some men deserve to outlive their own certainty. As for Moonfall, it never stopped demanding honesty. The mark on Lyra's wrist warmed whenever she reached for control in anger. Not enough to dominate her, enough to remind her. She was grateful for that more often than she admitted aloud. A power that never challenged its wielder was only waiting to become a weapon. By the time Thaw came to the lower passes, Lyra was no longer merely surviving history. She was shaping it. That was when Kale came to her without strategy, without emergency, and without any reason except one. Choice. It was evening. The last snow still clung to the shadowed parts of the wall. Moonfall's fountain ran clear under a pale gold sky. Lyra stood alone in the courtyard, reading one of the final Western Review summaries when she felt him before she heard him. The bond between them was not the same as it had once been. Not blind, not unearned, something quieter now, something that no longer mistook inevitability for entitlement. Kale stopped a few feet away. No alpha chain. No court blacks. Just dark training clothes and the face of a man who had become more dangerous by becoming more honest. Do you have a moment? He asked. Not command, request, that still mattered. Lyra folded the papers. You look too serious for a harmless conversation. That's fair. They stood in silence a moment, wind moving through the courtyard. Then Kale said, I loved the version of myself that could carry every burden alone. I thought that was strength. It wasn't. It was arrogance rewarded so long it looked noble. Lyra listened. She did not rescue him from his own honesty. I rejected you because I believed choosing your pain for you was better than risking uncertainty with you, he said. Then I spent months learning that uncertainty with truth is still cleaner than certainty built on control. His eyes did not leave hers. I love you, not because the bond once snapped into place, not because Moonfall changed the balance of power between us, not because I'm guilty and want absolution shaped like romance. I love you because every truth that should have turned you cruel made you more exact instead, because you make power answer for itself, because standing near you leaves no room for the cowardly version of me to survive. Lyra's heart beat once, hard enough to hurt. This was the danger now. Not humiliation, not politics, not war. Being loved by someone who had once proven capable of wounding her at the exact center, and had since become the kind of man she could respect without having yet fully decided whether that respect should be allowed to soften into something else. Kale drew a breath. I'm not asking you to forget Moonfall. I'm not asking you to call what I did misunderstood. I'm not asking you to trust me just because I finally learned how wrong I was. He stepped closer but stopped before touch. I'm asking whether the woman who can walk away from me and still keep everything she built would ever choose me while fully able not to. That was the right question. Finally, not would fate restore us, not have I paid enough. Not haven't I proven myself, would you choose me even now that you don't need to? Lyra looked at him a long time. She thought of Moonfall, the rejection, the ache, the public wound. She thought of Moonfall, the trial, the mark, the lesson that power without self-scrutiny corrodes its owner. She thought of Kale laying down legal reach in front of his pack, of him accepting public blame, of him learning, painfully and imperfectly, that love offered after harm only means anything if it does not demand the injured person shrink the truth of what happened. And she thought of herself, not the servant girl, not the rejected mate, not even only the lady of Moonfall. The woman who now had the freedom to choose without fear being mistaken for destiny. That mattered most. Slowly, Lyra crossed the space between them. The bond stirred, careful, waiting, no longer assuming. She reached up and touched the scar at Kale's jaw, the one from the battle at the ravine. When you rejected me, she said quietly, I loved the possibility of a man you had not yet become. Kale did not move. Even breathing seemed risky to him now. I do not love men for their potential anymore, she said. Potential is cheap, choice is expensive. His eyes darkened with something almost painful. Still he said nothing. Good, he had learned not to crowd her answer. But, Lyra continued, I have watched your choices. And more importantly, I have watched what you did when those choices cost you something real. She laid her palm flat over his heart. The place where the bond used to feel like fate's hook and now felt more like a door neither of them could force without ruining it. If I choose you, she said, it will not be because the moon once tied us together. It will be because you learned how to stand beside my power without trying to manage it. It will be because you finally let law stand over your pride. It will be because the man in front of me now has become someone I can trust to hurt with honesty before he ever hurts through control again. Kale's voice was almost gone when he answered. Then choose me or don't. But let it be yours. There, that was the final proof. No pressure, no strategy, no fate used as leverage, only room. Lyra smiled. The same smile that had once frozen Moonfall and cost an alpha his certainty. Only this time it held no threat, only truth. I choose you, she said. Relief broke across Kale's face so raw and unguarded it almost hurt to see. He closed his eyes once briefly, as if even joy needed a second to become survivable. Then he touched her only when she tilted her face up and made the permission unmistakable. That mattered too. Everything mattered now. His hand at her jaw was careful, reverent. His kiss was not triumph, not reclaiming, not fate correcting itself. It was slower than that. A man receiving what he once lost because the woman in front of him decided, in full possession of her own power, that he had finally become worthy of hearing yes. Moonfall's wards glowed pale silver along the outer walls. The fountain hummed softly behind them. The keep did not surge or seize or command. It simply held. When Lyra finally drew back, she rested her forehead against his and said, If you ever publicly embarrass me again, I'm taking another fortress. Kale laughed, breath warm against her skin. I would expect nothing less. She smiled wider. Then she gave him the line he would carry for the rest of his life. The difference between that night and this one, Alpha, is simple. He looked at her. What difference? That night, Lyra said, you rejected me because you thought power meant deciding for me. She touched the mark at her wrist, then the center of his chest. Tonight I choose you because you finally learned it doesn't. And if the moon, goddess herself, was watching from whatever cold silver place gods keep their favorite stories, then perhaps even she smiled. Because in the end, Kale Thorne learned the hardest lesson any alpha ever could. Rejection was never free. Humiliation always has a price. And the woman he thought he could publicly discard had not just survived. She rose, she judged. She chose, and when she finally loved him back, it was not because fate demanded it. It was because he had paid enough to be worth hearing the answer.